right along. I will call the May 17th, 2021 Board Workshop to order. It is on, yes, thank you. First item on the agenda is a consent agenda, which consists only of a personnel report. Does everyone have the opportunity to review that?
I move approval of the consent agenda as posted.
I'll second that. Seconded, is there any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Motion carries. Oh, Julie. Okay, so 4 of us are in the room and we have 1 board member who needed to participate remotely today. So next we move on to special presentations. And this is the 2021-22 budget.
Absolutely. We're going to hand this over to Jeanette.
Apparently we can't have our mics on.
No.
No.
And she'll walk the board through the presentation as we're sitting here today, where we're at with the budget itself. As the board knows, it's an ever-evolving budget, especially in this year, with many things continuing to move around. But I'm excited for Jeanette to walk through the presentation for the board. And then we've just asked, we're going through it, ask questions in the moment. Because as you're on that slide, I think it'll be a lot easier context for the board and for Jeanette, so as a workshop, a little less formal. Julie, same to you online. If there's a question you have, just pause and then we'll answer that in a moment. Okay? With that, Jeanette.
Okay. So yes, as Paul said, definitely feel free to ask questions. I will make one small adjustment. I'll pause at each section because I think a lot of the questions you probably have will come in the next slide or the next slide. And so we'll definitely take those moments to pause and get those questions. So if you need to write them down, feel free. Also, as Paul said, the budget for me it's kind of like a living, breathing person, right? It's always evolving. Even after we adopt the budget in July, August, it's still living and breathing all throughout the year. There's still modifications and changes that happen. And so basically right now what we're going to look at is kind of like a snapshot. Basically that's what it is. Right around now, we're probably about 85% of the way done with the budget, and really we're focusing on fine-tuning, really looking through, making sure we've captured everything, making small tweaks if we need to, and really focusing mostly on that non-staffing piece of it is where we're at right now. So with that, let's go ahead and start. So again, the budget really is a value statement. That's really what it should be. And so we are working towards that, and we are constantly evolving and changing, and everyone's dealing with my annoying questions all of the time, but really trying to get down to, the board values and the district values, excellence in learning, equity, and accountability. That's really what we should be about, and that's what our budget should be about. So that's the focus of our work. Budget timeline on the next slide. So first 2 crossed off. We are on today, the budget workshop. And then following today, we will have June 22nd, another board presentation just at the regular meeting. It'll just be part of that, and we'll get an update of your production and the other funds. And then July 12th, that's when the budget is due to the ESC, and it's available for the public as well in the draft form. July 27th is a special board meeting. And that really is that public hearing piece of the process. And so that is a date on your calendars. And then August 10th is another board presentation. Any final changes after the ESC has reviewed it, which typically there is not any, but just in case. And then also that budget approval process for the board. So any questions on the timeline? So diving right into revenues. First piece of revenues and the biggest driver of the revenues is the enrollment projection. And as you guys know, this year it's been a very moving target, and I believe it will continue to be a moving target for the next several years. So, really looking at cohort survival, looking at birth rates. We did some surveys this year, analyzing that information, trying to glean what it could tell us. Also, Pinnacle's prep is now, or they will be starting and opening in the fall. So looking at that, we expanded programs at CCP. So how does that affect our enrollment? Just all the big changes really that have come across this year. So we're trying to capture all of that. And then, you know, WIA, kind of what does that look like? How does that look in our system for the next several years? So on the next slide is the birth rates for kinder. So it is interesting to look at it. You know, the first handful of years, you know, you really see that trend of, you know, being on target essentially, birth rates compared to our kindergarten enrollment. I think, you know, we were doing really good with that, and then COVID came along. And so you kind of see that in that 2020 year, and that's this current school year, and you see that pretty sharp decline down to that 456 compared to the 526 of the births. So, you know, that I think is a COVID impact, and we will see what, you know, what happens with that in the long term. Do we get a bigger kindergarten class this coming school year? Do we have more first graders that enroll without being kindergartners? There's just a lot of unknown impact on the system, and we're trying to work through how do we make that more of a known impact now versus, you know, first day of school. Oh boy, we've got a lot of kids and we don't have enough staff or whatever the situation is. So definitely trying to work on that. Anything in the out years is mostly projections at this point, but definitely going to be an unknown factor coming up.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So pre-registration data, what have we gleaned from that information at this point?
A lot of it was used to kind of just get an idea of kindergarten registration, and you know, it's a new thing for the district, and so we didn't see an overwhelming response, but it kind of gave us an idea of like, okay, I think our projections are totally out of the ballpark. And, you know, I feel pretty comfortable with our projections for kinder for next year. I think if anything, they're probably on a little bit on the low side, which I prefer. So that was some helpful information. Also, there was a few students that we saw that were indicating that they might just go right into first grade. So that was interesting as well. Like I said, it wasn't, you know, completely overwhelming of, oh my gosh, we've got 200 kids coming into kindergarten or something, or first grade or something next year. So, you know, I think it's something we can evolve with and adapt and change as we go along, and you know, really build that education side of it as well. Any other questions on the birth rates?
I guess I'm going to launch into the COVID question. I saw the running start in 11th grade. I saw the pinnacles. I saw the tracking. What I didn't see, oh yeah, sorry, this started. Apologize, I'm not. Is I didn't want to launch straight away into the COVID absence in kindergarten question, because I know it looks like you're being conservative, but I was looking for an assumption of some kind of kickback. And, you know, I can see the other variances like running start in 11th grade, pinnacles in 6th grade, and the clear tracking from your historics in all the other grades. But I didn't see any uptick in your assumptions for missing 50 or so students from this year.
Yeah, and again, you know, in that effort to be somewhat conservative, but I think also that's really an unknown. You know, from my perspective, that pre-registration survey didn't necessarily indicate an overwhelming response. And like I said, you know, come August, that's typically when people will, you know, flood the schools and register the kindergartner. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens if that really is the case, if we do, you know, really see a big influx. But from what I have heard from building sites at this point, that's not necessarily what they're feeling. There's not an overwhelming response from parents of flooding to the schools now to make sure they have a spot. Okay, on the next slide is the cohort survival. Or sorry, this is actually the previous enrollment. And so just a couple things to note, 16-17 school year, as you guys know, that was the Alcoa closure. And so that was, you know, a net impact there. And then also in 19-20 school year, when we had the closure, the enrollment stopped in March. And so that kind of affects things as well, because enrollment typically has a bell curve to it. And this is all just average. And if you guys can see in the far right-hand column, the 4-year average is what I'm using to project the enrollment for next school year. And so at the elementary level, we're pretty flat total, about 100% retainage. Then looking at the middle school, we're very close to that 100%. And then at high school, there is a slight decrease, but I believe that is all pretty much attributed to that Running Start program, because those students aren't counted for in that bucket. On the next slide is the cohort survival, and I apologize, there is a lot of information on this slide, but I wanted to really point out again that, and I just realized the grades are not on here, but that third to last line for, you know, where you're seeing the 80s and the 70s and the 90s percentage wise, that is, again, that 11th grade, and that's when students enroll in Running Start. The other thing that's interesting is the kindergarten classes incoming are a lot smaller than our graduating senior classes at this point in our you know, life as a district. So, you know, overall, that might change in the next few years. It could change next year, just depending, but that's kind of where we've been at historically for the last several years. And so, you know, that could very well play into it as well. Our Running Start numbers have stayed pretty constant. This year they've increased. But that 12th grade class from the prior year that is leaving our system is bigger than our incoming kindergarten class. So it's definitely an interesting impact that we get to navigate. And then also on impact, yeah, this slide here shows 4-year projection, basically also the current year on that as well. That shows, you know, overall, we are going to be facing some tough waters ahead with our enrollment declining. There's a few things that are impacting that. Again, Chemicals Prep. For next school year, we are anticipating 75 students roughly going to Chemicals Prep. And so that is the 6th and 7th grade classes for next year. And then in the out years, I've projected 50 students in each 6th grade class from here, or starting in 22-23 until 24-25 school year. Also, again, that incoming class being smaller than the outgoing class, that, you know, it is what it is, and that, I guess, like I said, we'll see if that changes. And again, just a reminder, every year we budget again, and we're always looking at enrollment, and things can definitely change. Things will probably be different in the fall than what we're thinking it is now. And so we'll just constantly be evaluating that, and you know, hopefully the growth in our valley brings more families, and you know, that will help us. We'll see. And that is the last enrollment piece, so I will take questions. Yes, I apologize. There is a lot of information. I will try to keep it in the cloud level, so you guys don't get too lost in the craziness. But so we'll go into the next section, which is the legislative update. Kind of give you guys some high-level information on that. So the next slide shows the funding changes. So these are things that are, mostly pertinent to the school year. So there was a couple enrollment hold harmlesses in the legislative bills. Wenatchee School District does not qualify for any of them. So there's that. There is transportation hold harmless funding. And so we are eligible to receive that in the current school year, which is very nice. And then also there is a funding model change for next school year, just due to the ridership impact of the pandemic. And so we will be, that impact is included in the budget. Also, LEA, which is the state match funding. So for calendar year 2022, they will be using or allowing us to use the 1920 enrollment instead of the 2021 enrollment. So that will help us as well. And so that's included. Small increase, but it's a win for the tech center. Class size funding is going from 20 to 19. So that basically increases their staffing units, which increases their funding. Also, IPD, which is the implicit price deflator. So that's basically a function in the budget that increases allocations. And so that's 2% this year, projected to be 1.6% next year. There's also retirement rate increases, and then the insurance rates decreased, but the amount they decreased by this year is being increased next year. So it's really just shuffling cards around, which we all do. And then on the next slide, just some other miscellaneous changes for your information. In the budget, there is an extension of transition services for SPED students who turned 21 in the 1920 and 21 school years. So that is an allowable change. Also, in 2022 school year, there is a 0.5 FTE increase for high poverty schools related to counselors. And so that will be a change for next year's budget. Lunch co-pays are being eliminated for the reduced price. So there will be a free and a paid, and those are the only two categories. Next school year, my understanding is that the same model will continue that we're on now. And so that won't really change next year's anything, but in the 22-23 school year, that would be in effect. And then also additional funding for technology in the 22-23 school year, but from what I read, it sounds like those funds will be restricted in some kind of way for something specific. So more to come on that. So the next slide here shows the revenue side by side, just the state revenue. A couple of things to note. So the percentage there is the percentage of the total enrollment in the or total revenue in the budget. And so the revenue total is shown toward the bottom of that slide, but you see those percentages, decrease when you're looking at the proposed budget, the 21-22. And that really is just due to the CARES funding being in the budget. And so it's kind of takes away the percentage from the state and pushes it towards the CARES because that's a new budget item and it is a good chunk of money. We'll talk about that in a second. Also, the state apportionment being lower, our revenue, our enrollment is also lower, and our state apportionment is all a function of enrollment 100%. And so, that impacts the state apportionment. It actually affects quite a number of our revenues on the state side. So there is that. Any questions on the state revenue?
I'm wondering, Jeanette, if you can tell us about under funding changes. You said that our enrollment the hold harmless bills that went through the legislature. I know there was, they went from 2 years down to 1 year, and you said that we don't qualify. I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit, just so people watching the board understand what those limitations are, why we didn't qualify. Thanks.
Yeah, so one of the big ones was the amount of federal CARES funds we're getting. And so that was part of the formula essentially that the state legislature put in. So basically they would hold harmless you to match or make sure that you got a certain amount per student of federal CARES funds. And because our poverty is, you know, at the state that it is in for our community, we actually get a fair portion of the CARES funds. And so that's basically what bumped us out of qualification for those funds. Even though you can't spend the money on the same things that, you know, no one has anything.
And I have a question. We're used to look in the budget of 112 million, and you've got 117.7 there. And I'm guessing that might be CARES for this year. But then if you go to 21, 22, there's a similar gap between 120 million described, including 12 million for CARES, and 127 as a total.
Yes, so the CARES funds, and we'll get to that in a second, but yeah, the CARES funds that are in the budget for revenue is about $12 million. And so, you know, if you were to take that off of the 127, that would bring us down.
Is the difference in CARES in and out subsidies back to back? The reason I'm saying that is those percentages between page 16 and I think it's page 19, they don't add up to 100%.
Oh, yes, sorry, I should
I
also
think we've got a
mention that.
different category that isn't being shown, and I'm ignorant.
Yes, so, and I apologize, I should have mentioned that as well. So I'm showing basically the larger buckets, the high level buckets, not necessarily the smaller buckets. And so
Well,
that's,
are those the other funds then?
those are not the other funds. They are also within the general fund. The other funds I'm talking about are like capital projects and debt service and that kind of stuff. But this presentation today, these buckets that are shown here are really, you know, the majority of the budget. And so other buckets are, you know, miscellaneous fines and fees, the small amount we get in investment earnings from the county for, you know, being our bank, those kinds of things that do, you know, do add up, but they aren't necessarily the meat and potatoes of the budget necessarily. So on the next meeting, you guys will see all of it, but I just really wanted to highlight those big factors today. Okay, so we will go to the next slide. So also just a reminder that our regionalization is decreasing each year, so that was included in the state information on the previous slide. Again, levy based on the voter approved amounts that were just voted on, and then also assuming a 4% assessed value growth, which is likely conservative. CARES funding, again, $12 million for that. Most grants have their allocations available for next school year, but if not, we're using the current year. New and hopefully solid word on the street is a 1-year extension will be available for Lincoln and Lewis and Clark. So we're very excited about that for 21st century. And so that will be, you know, something we work on over the next probably 6 months or so to, you know, get some solid funding for that program for continuation of that. And then also Newberry expires, but you know, we'll see if there's also an extension available for them. Extensions for all. So the next slide really focuses on the CARES funding, and it gets very confusing, and there's a lot. So I really wanted to just kind of boil it down to the board. So we have CARES round one. CARES round one is pretty much already spent for the most part. We are just working on spending that out based on things that have already happened. CARES 2, that one is about 5.7 million, and you guys can kind of read what we're planning for on spending on that. A lot of that has already been spent, and the majority of that will be spent before the next budget takes effect on September 1st. CARES 3, that's the newest one. There's not an application out yet, but it's about $13 million is what we are kind of hearing at this point. A lot of that we, got plans for already and kind of been working on in the background. Once we got word that it was coming through. And so we are working on that. Again, the application's not out yet, so we don't have final approval or anything, but from what I've heard, it is happening. And then also there's a number of other CARES or ESSER or whatever the acronym is. Other funds available that are not necessarily direct to the school district. So there's CARES funds that are specific to SPED, and those are, again, I've heard they are coming. So once we get an idea of what that is, we will update the board. There's also CARES funds that were allocated to OSPI, and so the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. And so they are doing grants, competitive grants, and so we are applying for those and plan to apply for those as as they are warranted. Right now we're submitting claims for hotspot reimbursements specifically. There's also other CARES funds that are available to homeless students that I believe are going to another department within Washington. And then there's also FEMA funding, and so we are actively applying for FEMA funding and slowly getting that funding. But as eligible expenses occur, we are working with the FEMA department to claim those funds. So on the next slide is side by side of the federal revenue, and so federal and local. Levy funds are the largest portion of local funds. There are other local funds that come through, but they are not a large portion. Again, CARES kind of skews things. As you guys can see, it's almost 9.5% of the total revenues, which is a large chunk. And so, that just kind of shifts those percentages from the other buckets towards the CARES. Any questions on that? We'll move right along. The next piece of the puzzle is staffing. The large majority of the district budget is spent on staffing costs, and so we spend a lot of time going through that. So the first piece is classified staffing. And so there's not really much change in classified staffing, There's a lot of shifting, within between categories. There is some shifting from basic ed into categorical programs. We, made WIA happen, so there's some additional staffing there in the O2 and O3 category. And then also within the, I call it district office, but really it's all encompassing technology, M&O, grounds, custodial, a lot of this office here on this floor, those kinds of things. Previous positions that we discussed, looking at some equity support, an assistant translator, and then also an additional tech staff. Or not additional, but replacing the position. Okay, the next slide.
One other question on transportation. So it seems like we're in a pinch on transportation, constantly needing to hire folks and we're short. Why are we projecting a decrease in FTEs for transportation?
So I did not do the budget last year, but I know I built this budget on the projected routes that we will need for coming back full time. And then I also built in some extra. And so the capacity is there in this current year budget. Like I said, I don't know what last year's budget included, how many, hours or whatnot was included on that, but I feel comfortable in our 21-22.
So compared to this year, where does our staffing line up for next year? As you look at transportation, as opposed to just looking at the budget, maybe a different way of asking that question. What's the real number we currently have versus what's the projected number we're looking at next year?
Right, I was going to make a comment that there might be a difference if you look at the vacancy rate, where a budget assumes you're fully staffed in both cases. That might be useful to highlight that to ask the question.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So I believe right now we have, I want to say close to 24, 25 routes, something like that. And I believe next year's budget is built on close to 28 or 30. And so there is additional routes built into next year compared to where we are currently at right now. Not looking at last year's budget, but right now. And yeah, there is some vacancies that are filled with substitutes right now.
So I guess I'm confused. So if we have more routes next year, are we expecting, these are the FTEs. So you're saying we would have a bigger sub pool to handle more of those routes? Is that, I guess, I'm not sure how to ask it, I guess, but if we're currently at 24, 25, but we're increasing our routes next year, I guess I would expect to see our transportation employee numbers go up for FTE, but are we, is it that they're not FTA, we're looking at more part-time folks? Because I know this is FTE, so.
Maybe Kelly can explain you better than that.
Sure, thank you.
Well, I'll give it a try. I think the important thing is that's FTE, not necessarily actual people.
Right.
So it takes the 8 hours in order to equal 1 FTE. Jeanette built the budget based on X amount of people, and that will give us plenty to get all the routes filled, probably plus some. Just in case, we're counting on 28 routes, if we happen to have 30, she's built in the staffing to cover that 30. She didn't do the budget for the 2021, so I don't know what Larry projected as how many staff we need, but it was much higher than what we actually did.
Thank you, that's very helpful. So, yeah, so the FTEs are kind of adding up all those part-time because we know that we've done the hybrid model for a better part of this year, which meant several routes for each building a day, right? Not instead of 2 routes, it was 4 routes. So per, right? 4 trips per route. So, all right, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to jump into the certified staffing on the next slide. So rounding up a little bit, so in 2021 budget, there was 570 roughly FTE for certified staff, and then in 21-22 budget, there's projected to be roughly 590 FTE. Again, there's a lot of movement between categories in these staff positions as well. we're gonna kind of go into that a little bit more detail on the next slide, but as far as this slide goes, ALE, so you see a large change there. We have WIA now, and that's in the budget. It was not in the budget last year. At this point, we are being conservative on that point in the sense that I'm building in more staff positions than we might need based on enrollment. It's still kind of early in those projections. And so I'd rather build almost counts, not as intended, but worst case scenario, make sure we have the staff positions budgeted, just in case we need them, and then hire less if we need to. Also CTE went up a fair bit. There was 3 additional new positions, but then there was some movement as well. A small increase in categorical and then a slight decrease in BEA. So we'll jump to the next slide and provide some more information on that. So BEA, some of that is the elementary assistant principals, about 3.6 FTE increase, but really the financial increase, it was a flat increase. There was no change in the financial aspect of it. And really the FTEs actually just came from the categorical programs into BEA. So it's just really inter-district movement, which actually allowed us to have some more flexibility in our categorical funds to provide additional supports for instruction as well. So kind of a 2 for on that one. Also expanded offerings in CTE and some grants, and we moved some FTE from basic ed into those 2 programs. And then also there was a lot of conversation around class sizes and really, feeling like coming out of the pandemic, coming out of, the year that we're coming out of, having lower class sizes would really, really benefit students coming out of the pandemic. And so we are choosing to support that 1 more year and continue that. And so that is also, included in the budget. The AOE and WIA we talked about, that funding will come from the state enrollment funding and also CARES funds. We are claiming CARES funds for the alternative WIA. CTE, so we've talked a bit about that, and I wanted to kind of, explain, yes, there's a lot of new positions within CTE, and there's a lot of staff movement from basic ed, but that funding comes from those additional class offerings. So once a class becomes CTE eligible, then those students are also counted as CTE students, and the funding goes to CTE. So the staff cost moves to CTE, but also the revenue moves to CTE. So really, those are hand in hand. Also, lack high poverty. There was funds that were included in the budget last year, but they weren't included as staff costs. They were included as non-staffing costs, and so those positions were hired late into the 2021 school year, and they will be continued in their non-continued. So all of those positions are non-continuing just because those funds are year to year. But those positions essentially just switched from non-staffing costs to staffing costs. So, starting into next school year, and actually starting this school year, we really started having conversations around staffing and how do we want staffing to look, and how do we want to allocate staffing. There's a benefit to having an equitable system across the school district that is based on student FTE. And so we are exploring that. We are having conversations about that at Happer. And then also in the early or late winter, I guess, Kelly and I had conversations with buildings about what's your projected enrollment. You know, how many sections or how many classes do you have at each grade level? You know, what do you need? What are those class sizes projected to look like? Those kinds of conversations. And so really that kind of was a soft launch of what we're hoping to launch for next school year. Really looking at a student-funded or student FTE-driven model for classroom teachers as well as intervention support. And we started that this school year, really looking at what's your staffing, or sorry, what's your student count like? And then also, you know, what's your poverty? What other funds do you have available in your building? Those kinds of things. And so we started that process for intervention support, and that kind of ties into the para support as well. So not only will that really help kind of focus a little bit on equity, but also it really gives us that reason to, you know, evaluate and have conversations around the value, making sure that what we're doing is providing value in the system and it's what's best for kids, and we're actually, you know, seeing the growth that we want to do it. So really making sure that we're focusing on that promise statement and, you know, kind of putting our money where our mouth is. I'm sure there's no questions.
So I have a question about, as we look towards trying to support equity and having smaller class sizes, how are we doing that with our limited spaces in some of our buildings? So, because I don't get the sense that we have a lot of extra space in our buildings, but thank you, Paul, for this.
Yeah, absolutely. It really comes down to when we look throughout our elementary schools, especially for this year. And then as we look into next year, with 3 feet being kind of the expectation going into the fall, that we can fit our normal size classrooms, be 25 to at the middle and high school, you know, in that upper 20s, low 30s, we can make 3 feet happen. What we're trying to do is currently say, we're gonna keep those 7 FTE in the system because we know there are some, we're going to have some students at different levels when we return. So we're comfortable with the classroom size, being able to fit everybody in, even with the COVID mitigating strategies. But more importantly, for at least next year, taking that and using those FTEs to continue our current classroom rate of students per teachers. However, as we look into the future, that's where Jeanette is talking about, as you'll see in the upcoming slides, we have to look, you know, with student enrollment going down, we can't keep current staffing for long term, or we'll just continue to eat up all fund balance. So that's why we're having conversations around kind of that per pupil allocation, as opposed to we just roll over the same number of staffing FTE to each school, really have those conversations around students. And then also having the conversation around LAP and high poverty dollars. How do schools that do have that status, how do those dollars go into effect around staffing? How do we use those dollars to have the greatest impact for our students? The other piece that we'll be looking at as well, what has worked over our years? I mean, there's been a lot of dollars spent through title dollars, through LAP dollars, through different programs. Really having a much deeper understanding of what's actually impacted student outcomes. Because oftentimes it's just the same thing we do each and every year. We get the dollars, hire staff, we do those pieces, but we really want to understand better what's the overall impact for kids in outcomes.
Thank you, that really helps me understand.
Yeah.
The the gist of why we have kind of those extra staff and how we're going to use that. So thank you.
Maybe I'll go in. At a top level, it's aggregate, and you've explained how in certain areas like CTE, you've got 3 more people. The 3 more people in CTE are the students. You've got fewer students in basic ed, and you've got assistant principals and stuff like that. But just doing it, and I know that from previous budget experience, there's been a demographic shift, that's the right word, in students to require a higher, more labor-intensive teaching, depending on the mix of students you've got. It's been a generic trend. But I just wanted to look at, there's a 2% reduction.
What slide are you on? So we'll go to the.
No,
okay.
I think this is pretty simple. There's a 2%, because I don't know the answer. I'm just saying, this is an observation, and I think we're great from an efficiency point of view. We need to make sure that we're there. And part of it may be vacancies and budget to budget fooling us. But if we look at the top level, which is apples, oranges, and onions all mixed together, we've got a 2% decrease in students and a 3.5% increase in certified staff. Now, some of that 3.5 is explained, but this is simply an observation to really look carefully at that, particularly when from an efficiency point of view, we have to manage a projected declining enrollment. And so all I'm saying is this is an observation that we need to be really sure that we've got the planning right.
Absolutely. So one of the things that, as cabinet, we've been talking about the last couple of weeks is exactly where you're at, making sure when we bring that final budget to the board, you know, closer to June 22nd, and then much closer in that August timeframe, that we've been able to look through our budgets and our staffing and where we actually at, how close are we? We're going to have better understanding from the enrollment side. Every day we're a little bit better on the enrollment side of things. One of the things that we talked about is, and this takes time in a community, is how we have to shift our registration. And did this in my former district where we have to start earlier here. But just because we start earlier does not mean that our community right out of the gate is used to starting earlier. And it literally took us, my former district, 4 years. When we started in February, and like nobody registered. I mean, it was really pretty interesting. But by that 4th year, by the end of February, we're having 85% registration rates. But it takes time for the community to adjust. And right now we have currently our community, and Mark's our historian, he's like, yeah, August is kind of and Maria remembers as well, August is when we start getting real numbers. And for some of our schools, it's like the week before, if not the day of. Like, oh no, why would I be registering for school way back then? I register now. So we're trying to do a culture shift that will help us be more specific early on at this time with the board. I'm hopeful by next year we're even closer with those numbers. But the other conversation we just had today was, in the future, we're going to have, you know, conversations in August where we may be shifting staff to a school or a grade level that has a higher enrollment number than we had in the past, where in the past we would just add a staff member and not move somebody specifically. So having different kind of conversations like that.
Lots of change. That's all I can say, lots of change.
So I guess, and I understand that you guys are trying to budget and plan for those enrollment numbers that we don't yet have, right? So we're hoping that in August we'll have more folks signing up. But yeah, I guess we cannot project having a staff level here and then we find out, oh, we really have a lot more kids, and then we have to go out and hire more staff. So it sounds like the plan is to hire those staff, have them at the ready. What if we don't need them? I guess is my follow-up question. So because they're new, are they on a temporary status? How does that play out if our enrollment doesn't boost a lot?
So great question. Yeah, I'll jump first and then Jeanette go. So one of the reasons why we're trying to back everything up is directly related to what you were talking about, staffing. Per contract, we have to make sure that staff know that are we going to renew their contract for the following year or not. So it puts the organization in a bad place because one, we want the best staff for our students in our community. But when we don't have actual hard numbers that we can really rely on, it's hard for us to walk away from a staff member. As I ran back over here for a phone a friend, currently it's at that May 15th that we have to know those things by. And generally speaking, we like to do that even earlier so staff can make some decisions about where do they want to go. So that's a big date for us and why we're trying to back everything up sooner and get our community more aware of registration. I mean, you saw in the last few months, a lot of signs out. We have to do even a better job with that, getting into our community and letting them know how to do it. And quite honestly, we have to make it easier. The process is, the full registration process is pretty laborious. I mean, it's a pretty detailed process. So we have to find different ways to help reduce some of that processing. Jeanette?
Yeah, and I would just reiterate, we did make that conscious effort to keep those class sizes a little bit lower. And so, the enrollment, when you're talking a conservative budget, your enrollment is conservative in the sense that you just budget kind of based on the kids that you have now rolling up. Those are kind of your known factors, right? And then on your staffing, you're budgeting conservatively worst case scenario, having higher staffing. So it's almost opposite. But you're really building in that essentially that contingency plan for yourself. And obviously things can change, but I feel hopeful that our enrollment will be pretty close to what we have now. So I'm hoping that doesn't, decline again. But if it does, we will address it at that time. But yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing is, acknowledging that yes, we will have lower class sizes next year. We are coming out of the pandemic. We know those kids will need that extra support. And we are hopeful that, having that as one of our strategies will be helpful.
I guess I'm still not clear on, for the staff that we don't have, if we're hiring extra staff, if those enrollment numbers don't come to fruition, what happens then? Because we've just not been in that position before, where we're expecting that maybe our numbers are going to boost up because we've seen kind of steady decline, and now with COVID we got hit kind of hard, and we're hoping that's going to bounce back. But if it doesn't bounce back as high as we'd like, what if we hire extra? And granted, we're trying to keep those class sizes small. Will we be able to place everyone, I guess is my question, even if the enrollment numbers don't bounce back? So
yeah, we will be able to place everyone. I think that I feel pretty confident in that. Again, there might be lower class sizes, and we kind of just take the hits as they come, like we did this year with our decreased enrollment. Looking at pinching our pennies where we can to make sure that we're being fiscally responsible. And I think our buildings and our departments are very, I guess they're used to that after this year, which is, unfortunate, but that is the way it is. And we're all one team and we're all, kind of in it together. So, I guess that's how we would handle that. I don't anticipate, people don't sit around and twiddle their thumbs at school districts, I'll just say.
I also want to add, we're not actually hiring additional staff in hopes that we have, 50 extra kindergartners. We are just replacing the current staff members that we have and assuming that we're going to have at least the amount of kindergartners that we currently have. That would still have fairly small class sizes, but we're not anticipating, we're not hiring Jeanette thinking, we're probably going to need this extra kindergarten team. So just want to make it clear, it's just replacement of staff that we already have.
I like this phone a friend thing. I'm gonna bring Kelly all the way. Okay, so we're gonna boil it down to some dollars here. So, the buckets we're gonna look at are certified salaries, classified salaries, benefits, and then MSOC, which is all costs that are not related to staffing. And so, you know, again, looking at the totals going from 117 million to 129 million, 9 million of that is the one-time CARES funding. And so, you know, that jumps that number up quite a bit. But really, again, it is that one-time funding. So it kind of makes things look a little bit different. And all of that funding, or all of that expense budget is in the MSOC category. I did not place any of that into the certified or classified staffing pieces because, you know, that is one thing that we will continue to look back on is how much did we budget for in staffing? How much did we budget for in benefits? And looking at that, you know, year over year over year, and trying to keep that apples to apples comparison and not throw the apples or sorry, oranges or onions into it. So that's where that expense amount lives is in that MSOC line item. And you see it does not increase by the full $9 million. We believe that there's some capacity in there that basically moving costs from that MSOC into the CARES funding. So able to pay for planned expenses out of the CARES. Any questions? Okay, moving on to the next slide. So expenses, looking again at those same categories, but just looking at percentage of budget. I'll say again, the green slice of the pie is those non-staffing costs, and that's where those CARES funds live. And so that increase from 16.2 to 20.5% of the budget really is just due to those influx of CARES funds. So it really shifts the percentage of spending towards that category. It kind of skews the numbers a little bit, which on the surface level looks a bit strange. Any questions on the expenses? Now we're getting down to the end of it, the fund balance. Again, early projections, I will be continuing to fine tune this over the next month, 2 months until the final budget. So at this point, kind of just some back history. So 18-19, we started out with about 8.5% fund balance. And then 19-20 school year, 1 year later, we had almost 9%. So that was pre-pandemic. So that was September of 2019. And then post-pandemic, September of 20. So the 2021 beginning balance increased to 11.4%. There was a number of changes within our expenses when school closed. And so less substitute costs and a lot of other things like athletics and things like that. So increased fund balance there. Right now, I am projecting roughly 10% fund balance to end the school year on. So which would roll into obviously next year's beginning balance, being at about that 10%. Right now with the information that was presented, we would end at almost 7%. That is below kind of what I'm calling the pre-pandemic state of things, which is about that 9% almost. Through a number of things included on the side of the slide, including fine-tuning, finalizing, MSOCs and staffing and other things. really, my goal is to be at about that 8% mark for this budget. And so that would kind of get us back in that ballpark. But that 8% is kind of my, like, this is where the healthy state is. And I believe that 8% is also the board fund balance, minimum fund balance policy. So
I thought it was 5%.
is it 5%? Yes, I think
It's 5%, but that's unencumbered, right? So are these, when you're talking about the 8 to 10% and 11.4, are you talking about unencumbered fund balance?
So not necessarily unencumbered, because encumbrance relates to, more actual expenses. So the 8, I believe you're talking undesignated,
Undesignated.
actually, yes.
Yeah.
No worries. So that is total fund balance. So that would be inclusive of restricted funds and all of that.
So I believe the board policy is 5% related to the unrestricted.
You are correct.
So do you have a breakout of that?
I do not, but I will make a note to put that in the next presentation, and I can follow that up.
Regarding our CARES funding, Jeanette, that needs to be spent by when? I'm assuming that cannot roll into our fund balance.
No, it's not like check.
Right, so, when is the CARES 3, when does that expire?
CARES 3 technically expires in 2024. So it's got a fairly long life to it. One of the reasons is they are anticipating a number of districts wanting to do more capital improvements to buildings for like HVAC and infrastructure on networks and things like that, which don't necessarily happen overnight. And don't necessarily sometimes happen even within 1 year. So that's, the reason for that. And so, over time, as we budget every year, because guess what, we get to do this next year too. We'll be evaluating, okay, how much do we have left? How much do we need a budget in the next budget year for CARES? Those kinds of things. But right now, we're going to take it 1 year at a time, kind of see what's left. We're really trying to make sure that we're not just addressing necessarily immediate needs, we're doing that, but also what's long-term financially and non-financially going to be a good thing for the district, such as infrastructure on the networks, HVAC systems, technology, those kinds of things.
Jeanette, can you just speak about it being highly audited?
Yes, it is very highly audited. So there are specific requirements and basically different categories that you can spend within. And so it's all audited. They're all federal funds. So we have to follow federal guidelines and federal restrictions. Everything has to be documented and then documented again and then documented again. And so, we're very mindful of that, making sure that we can justify every single purchase, every single dollar, and tie it back to those categories that are allowable. And so definitely a highly regulated thing. We actually just went through our first audit for CARES.
With the first round?
Yep, with the first round. And we passed.
Is that done by the state auditors, the same ones that do the regular audit?
Yep, it's all within the same audit. Okay, that's the last slide. Any questions? I know it was a lot of information. Good work.
Yeah, really good work. And board, as you also reflect on this in the coming days, as you think about upcoming, June 22nd is when Jeanette will be back with us for a real in-depth, all categories, all funding there. Please send us any questions that you have. Make sure that we get that information to you, we'll make sure that you have that budget in timely manner, so you can also spend some time with it prior to the 22nd, so you'll see that as well. But like the question Laura asked, send those to us, and we'll get those to you. We'll turn those questions right around to you. Anything else?
Great. So seeing that there is nothing else on our agenda, I will adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, everybody. Caleb, thank you. Julie, thank you. Yeah,
I will. You